I'd like to welcome our audience today to our inaugural mid-career leadership discussion, Finding Our Next. And it's a great pleasure for me to share today's journey with a longtime friend, mentor, and hero, Dr. Sharonne Hayes. Dr. Hayes is professor of cardiovascular medicine at the Mayo Clinic. She founded and maintains Mayo's Women's Heart Clinic, served as Mayo Clinic's first Director of Diversity and Inclusion from 2010 through 2020. And during this time, Mayo Clinic was nationally recognized for its D&I accomplishments. With this work, she developed programs to enhance the professional and personal development and mentorship of women and minoritized physicians, promoting a more diverse workforce at Mayo and in the field of medicine. She's a tireless advocate for safe, equitable, and dignified health care. Workplaces that promote high-quality patient care, and Sharonne has developed programs to assess and mitigate unconscious bias in healthcare. She served on the board of directors of Women Heart and has been on their scientific council for more than 20 years. She's a nationally recognized educator and speaker on women's health and cardiovascular issues, health equity, and diversity and inclusion. Dr. Hayes served on our advisory board as we launched the American College of Cardiology's SJL Career Leadership Institute for Women in Cardiovascular Medicine, and interviewed me for our introductory video. So, Dr. Hayes, Sharonne, turnabout may be fair play. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandy. This is actually quite an honor, and it is turnabout. I know you will be kind.
So, Sharonne, we actually met early in our careers. And what always struck me is your clarity of vision in your leadership trajectory. Tell us a little bit about your leadership journey. Specifically, all the wonderful things you've done. Did you have a plan for the directions you took? How did you choose the path?
Sandy, I think if you thought I had a master plan, I had you fooled. Did I imagine my leadership trajectory? Absolutely not. There were periods in my young life that I actually thought I was going to have. I mean, in my young and naive life, like pre-cardiology fellowship, I imagined that I would be having a meteoric rise in my profession. And then reality hits. I mean, it hits because of the hard work and the barriers and all of those other things. So I will say there was a point where I had a very vague, and then life came in. And I think the one thing, if I reflect on my leadership trajectory, one, it was very uneven. Two, there was no master plan, but there are themes. And I think I do have a clarity of purpose and things that I think are right and for which I have passion. And those things, have kind of sustained me. And so I think some of my very early passions, and I'm saying in this case, like I have an example from middle school, but equity, fairness, people having equal access and being able and willing to speak out. I realized I've never been one who didn't speak out about that. And there were many times early on in my medical career that I felt like I couldn't, shouldn't, no one would listen. I might be penalized, but the words and the thoughts were still there. So equity, obviously you and I share being women and being minorities in the field, 5 or 6% when we entered. And so that was an interest, both the clinical care of women and health equity there and women. And then advocacy. I didn't know that word and what that meant, when I was speaking out, but realized there actually are techniques that can work. I also think that you can't underestimate the role of role models. I feel like I really at Mayo Clinic had many, many people who were very different than, I won't say I had a surfeit of women role models, but I had a lot of men who did really good things and were really good people and were able to maintain their values and purpose without stepping on other people alike. And so I had good role models. I wasn't I feel like when I talked to some other people, they didn't and almost felt like they had to claw. And when I reflect on that, I think the areas in which I have had leadership roles, DEI, women's health, women, one thing sort of led to the other. And sometimes people don't see the connection. And I don't think I knew because it was kind of organic. But if, I think about going back to equity. So it was equity back in the 90s when we realized the women in our practices were not responding or to the same drugs or tests that we were doing. And that led to, kind of being a leader, not necessarily knowing it, was trying to figure it out. So many times my leadership or what somebody else was, I saw a problem and I was trying to fix it. We're trying to uncover it. And I think when I think about other places, it was women getting inequitable care. It was our women in cardiology being treated differentially. I never thought of myself as a researcher, but even the research that I have done over the past decade on spontaneous coronary artery dissection was I had patients who challenged me and said, I think there's more going on. What's Mayo doing to study SCAD? And so I very much think there were themes in my leadership that were patient driven and equity driven and did kind of link together. So did I have a grand plan? No. But when I reflect on some of the leadership opportunities, I don't think I even knew I was a leader sometimes. I actually have a leadership role at Mayo Clinic. I'm a vice chair of the department. But most of the time, I didn't have a formal leadership role. So I guess I had you fooled if you think I planned this all out.
Actually, as I reflected back, thinking of your trajectory, I thought about SCAD, the spontaneous coronary artery dissection, and women's heart health, and the fact that you didn't just see a patient with SCAD or a patient who needed women's heart care. You took it and became a leader. Tell us a little bit about what it is in you that was a spontaneous coronary artery corrector.
Well, I think there's two things and they're a little bit linked. One, a lot of my career I could reflect on right place, right time. I don't want to denigrate my achievements, but I was in the right place in the right time for many of these. And when I said that once, a friend of mine who's not in medicine, she's in communications, but she knows me very well and she knows the work because she worked at Mayo. She said, yeah, but Sharon, you actually recognized the serendipity and took it down the pike. And I reflected, okay, I think that's one of my strengths is that I have been able to follow an interest or an activity or a solution and realize when it was a dead end that I don't want to derail myself, but also that has taken me in some very good places. And I think that had to do with starting the Women's Heart Clinic back in 1998. That's before Hard Truth, before Go Red. That all came in 2002 and 2004. It was the SCAD is sort of listening to patients. I was very set up for that because the patients who came to me had gathered on Women Hearts online community and had said, what we read and what the doctors are telling each of us, that it's universally fatal, that it's so rare that, a cardiologist would see one or two in their lifetime. There's 70 of us. That doesn't seem right. And when they shared that with me, I remember saying, that sounds like a lot. And going back and doing a literature search and finding that the largest case series was 42 reports. And I'm like, that is. And I think I have a natural curiosity as well. So it was women, it was patient advocacy. And it turned out it was research too, but that was not something that I was always particularly drawn to. And so I think the other thing that how I have leveraged things is going with my strengths. There is a lot to be said for shoring up your weaknesses. I have plenty of those, and I have worked very hard over my career to bolster those things where I have gaps. But where I think I'm in a happier and more effective place is when I actually leverage the strengths that I have, recognizing that we can't all be strong in everything.
Well, you've had an incredible journey, and those are your superpowers. But it's all been at Mayo. You started as a fellow and you remained there through your career. You've also, and sort of hitting on this a little bit, is that you are dealing with the non-clinical challenges and your ability to navigate them. I think of bringing the women together to teach them to be advocates, developing the leadership skills that you have and the ability to build programs. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I sometimes think about myself as sort of a startup queen. I've reflected because it's not that I start something and then sell it off, right? But I have done several things where I started, like you, Sandy, with the SJL Institute, but where there was a gap, whether it was the Women's Heart Clinic, whether it was the Science and Leadership Symposium for Women with Heart Disease, where we partner with Women Heart, the SCAD research. I mean, there's several things where I sort of, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Mayo Clinic, because there really wasn't, there had not been a physician leader there. And I think, those are all non-clinical. I think of them as things that have really enhanced my career, particularly those that are outside of work. Clinical work is hard. So are some of these other things, but if that's our only focus and the only place that for which we derive satisfaction, we are going to be disappointed. I love patient care, but it's a grind sometimes. And having these things outside of that, I actually can bring back to the exam room sometimes and makes me a better physician, at least a less burnt out one. I think one of the opportunities, particularly at Mayo, which is very unusual, is we have rotational leadership, which did give me some opportunities. So by that, I mean that everyone at a leadership level, whether it's head of an office, whether it's a department or division chair, or even our CEO, has a term. And the term is usually, 4 years, kind of automatically renewable. And some people stretch it out till 10 if we need them. But we all know that we may be a leader and it is our job, or we'll be a failed leader, to not have a succession plan because somebody's got to follow us at 8 years. The other key component is that at 8 years, now maybe someone will take another leadership role, but they will go back to being, if it's my division or department chair, if I'm the division chair, when it rolls over, I will then have a new division chair that I will report to, and that is likely somebody who I was their boss. And so that culture of one, developing those who come after you, and also every 8 years or so, a role is going to come up that might have some appeal for you, has allowed me to be in a number of roles at Mayo. I was, in addition to the Women's Heart Clinic, I led our Office of Women's Health for a number of years. That gave me a much broader perspective about systems, about other specialties within women's health, and to advocate internally and externally. So I think there were a lot of opportunities that had to do perhaps with Mayo, but you also asked me if there was any advice. And I think there were some things along the way. As I said, go with your strengths. But one is, and I can reflect on certain examples, particularly when I was leading the Office of Women's Health, because this is back in the 90s where women's health was just still very much boobs and tubes, right? It was bikini medicine, and it was very much thought in the realm of OB-GYN. So as there was rising interest and science behind sex differences, not just in heart disease, neurology, GI, all of that, kind of getting leadership who were in the very traditional silos to see that was an important endeavor. For several years, we really got nowhere. And I felt like I was just beating my head against the wall. What I learned when actually I was no longer in that leadership role, I had rotated out, and a few years later, it blossomed under another leader, Stephanie Falbian. And I realized then and others that timing was really important in any organization, particularly a big one with lots of hierarchy. And that if we bang our head on the door, we may miss the window opening behind us. And that timing and running things up the flagpole. And I've learned that and been very successful. When it didn't work, it's not going around somebody's back. It's actually presenting it with it in a different way, perhaps in a different time frame. And we shouldn't forget that. I think I hear too often colleagues, both at Mayo and elsewhere, saying, we tried that and it didn't work. I said, well, it's a new day, and I think somebody might welcome that idea. I think one of the other things that when you stay in one organization for a long time, as I have, is looking outside your division or your department, whether that's for advice, mentorship, friendship, or research collaboration, because sometimes you can ask somebody else, how am I doing, who's looking out from the inside and hasn't got anything. And then outside our organization, and I know, Sandy, you got involved in ACC. I was very involved in Women Heart with a circle of really talented women physicians who were focused on heart disease in women, and often felt like they were the lone voice at their organization. So there was strength in getting together. And I remember when I was bumping up against some type of roadblock, and I had a colleague say, Sharon, you're so lucky they let you have a women's heart clinic. And I'm like, they let me. I had to push and shove. But that individual was not allowed to develop a women's heart program. And so sometimes it is the perspective from others that helps you realize things are better than you think.
I think we've both bumped our heads up against some of those barriers, and I love the idea of readdressing them. That's really good advice. You, as I am, are married to a physician, and you're specifically married to another cardiologist. Boy, do you have phones on both sides of the bed?
We do. Well, we did, and now we have our iPhones. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you raised a family, and your children are having children, and you're also caring for aging parents. It can be a lot to be that sandwich generation. Sometimes I feel like, there's not enough mayonnaise on the bread for things to slip. How are you managing it all? Any advice you can share with the next generation?
Well, I have several, I don't know if it's advice, but I do have some things that I have realized or have perspective on. I think first to acknowledge how darn hard it is. I do sometimes see this in my daughter, and she says, why is this so hard? It should be easier. Other people seem to be having an easier time. She's a professional. She's a college professor. Her husband's a physician. And I go like, no, this is super hard. Like, and it's probably not all sweetness and light over at their house. You just don't see it. They probably think you're rocking it. So I think one is acknowledging that this is a hard job. Being a cardiologist, it's a hard job. Being a parent, or being a spouse, it is. And I think also acknowledging the biologic realities that if we are going to choose to be a parent, that it is during a time of very often high intensity work, right? Early career. So kind of the advice I give that I sometimes wish I took, and now I'm giving to my daughter sometimes, is give yourself some grace. Seriously, it is hard work, and that not everything's going to be perfect at home or work or with your children or with your marriage. And it's sometimes okay to be good enough. But I think reflecting on where are the things that you want to be better than good enough, and it's probably relationships. And that's where the next step is. When I have young faculty who come to me, and I'm in a formal role where they come to me because I'm vice chair for academic development and faculty affairs within cardiology, this is it seems big, and it seems this period of your child's life or your family life is forever. But it is really, because I can say this now because I'm old, I can say this is a very short time in a long arc of a wonderful career. Like, I am so glad I'm a cardiologist. And it seems there's so much urgency that people are feeling throughout our careers. But this too will pass. And there will be a time where they need you less, where they need you differently. And you will maybe get more than 3 hours of sleep. And that during this time, it is okay perhaps to lean out a little bit, to depend upon others. And then some practical advice is accept or buy as much help as you can. Don't say I can do it. There are certain tasks that having other people do even if they don't get it exactly the way you do it, is really a joy. And I think you and I have talked about this as well, is you can't do it all. And so we often, particularly in early career, and I don't like to stereotype women, but I also think that women often want to please people and are more likely to say yes than no. And I think really practice your skills for implementing the mindful no. And that's in contradistinction to the mindless yes. And by that, I mean, I actually had to have almost a self intervention about 20 years ago because I was so stretched then. And I was saying yes to things that when I'd get on the plane to go give a talk, it's like, why am I doing this? And I knew why I was doing this because it was easier to say yes and no. And I was flattered if I was asked to do things, but it was too much, right? So I had to put together some priorities. I had to say, what are my goals? Whether it was work goals, family goals, relationship goals, professional goals. And then realize, okay, if I keep saying yes to this stuff, I'm not going to reach those goals. And then recognizing that only 24 hours a day. So if you say yes to something, you are actually saying no to something. That's an aha moment for some people. Oh, I just said yes to write this paper or to do this. And I said, okay, so is that going to come out of your sleep? Is that going to come out of your time with your family? I mean, because there's only 24 hours. And I think framing it that way, I'm saying this very simply. It is hard, but it gets easier if you practice it. And I got pretty good about realizing, okay, and I had to make some rules. One of the rules was because writing book chapters is not considered it is not a highly considered for academic advancement at May. It may be at other places, but that I'm a slow writer and I'd written several book chapters and I really had no like research that had published in or very little. And it was unbalanced. I had some mentors say, don't ever write another book chapter again. So I said, okay, I'm not going to write a book chapter. Now for all of the rules that I had, that's one example unless I had exceptions. It brings you joy or it helps you accomplish one of those other things that you want to accomplish. So the only book chapter I have ever contributed since I made that rule was in Annette Wenger's Women and Heart Disease book. And it was on a topic for which I could have written it by myself, but I said, if I'm going to do this book chapter, I am going to do something. And I had one of our nurse educators who worked in our patient ed, and I had our nurse practitioner in the Women's Heart Clinic be co-authors because nurses actually do a whole lot more in the patient educating. They're actually trained to do that. And so we wrote it kind of from patient education through physician education. And my nurse practitioner ended up being an assistant professor and getting academic rank. So I kind of feel that one exception brought me joy, even if it didn't do any of the other things. And it was a time sink, I will say, because I'm a slow writer. I try. And I still try to do that. But if I am going to do something, I have more perspective about who can I bring along with me.
That's awesome. And you paid it forward. You know, one of the things you mentioned brought to mind some work we've been doing in our mid-career program on perfectionism. And just to bring out that perfect is sometimes a goal that's destructive. And I think you sort of focused that a little bit.
Yeah, good enough is sometimes really good enough.
We recently had a session with Cohort 2 in the Mid-Career Leadership Institute on developing executive presence. And I would say that you have a very authentic leadership presence. There's an honorable quality about your leadership style that I've always admired. How have you stayed true to your authentic self as a leader?
You're very kind that you observed that. I'm glad because I think for me, several of the roles that I have held, if I was not authentic, I would have failed, right? And I think early on, it was really hard because early on, you're trying to honestly mimic other people you admire, right? But the people I had that I admired were all middle-aged men. Their style was, not going to be mine. It wasn't going to work for me. And so I struggled a little bit finding it. And I got some even as a resident and fellow, I won't say that's executive presence, but got feedback, which is where I realized that the feedback I was getting as a woman was quite different qualitatively and quantitatively. For a man, one was particularly, I would observe men, and this is in the old days when we had paper charts, but literally a male resident, throwing down a chart on a nurse's station, barking an order, and them just getting to it. And realizing if I did that, gosh, it would have just, right, multiple things. And so there were people, men and women, who I could adapt some of their qualities. I'll come back to the fact that I did have, a lot of great role models at Mayo, just not a lot of women in leadership. When I do think this is when there is a good time to ask for wise criticism, to actually ask for input from people. And this is not asking somebody who's just going to tell you how great you are. This is finding that person. If you have one person in your life or career who knows you well enough, knows your goals, knows you, and also is going to be honest and wants the best for you. So think about all of that. But when you find somebody like that who can give you that wise criticism, it sometimes kind of hurts, but you take it because it's from that individual. First of all, those individuals, if you've got one or two, it's gold, right? And I do have one or two who I could run things by because I trusted them. Early on, I was 2 years into my diversity and inclusion role, okay? So I had never had any formal leadership role other than being a clinic director. And now I am in an enterprise role, got 70,000 employees. Got to be the diversity and inclusion person across our sites in Arizona and Florida. Had actually never been there. And I was sitting at leadership tables and with department chairs and board members and everything. And yeah, I had a little bit of, I won't say imposter syndrome, but I definitely didn't know how to act. Like I'm looking around the room and trying to figure out how does one behave here. And at about 2 years, I had a 360. And so it was from a lot of those folks who were sitting, and there were many opportunities for me to improve and for things for me to work on. But what I realized, particularly in that particular role, my strengths, highest strengths, even though I had been very unsure, were in trustworthiness, comments that saying I didn't seem to have a hidden agenda. And you can imagine, particularly around the conversations we're having right now, that for that role, that was critically important because I can learn finances. I can learn a whole lot of stuff. But that part I realized was, if not innate, it was a muscle that I had developed. And I think for certain roles, that's really important. And so I can't say that my presence is necessarily was, again, very deliberate, but I followed along and got things from people that I respected and felt like I wanted to be like, and had the opportunity through some formal feedback that sometimes surprised me. I think that the comments people make about women's behavior, and because I was in a role in which I got to see 360s for many leaders, that they were qualitatively different. And I think, so you can't just, that's the other thing, is you can't take these comments and decide, oh, I better be a different person because of this comment that said, whether it's the clothes that I wore or the way that I spoke or whatever. We have to reflect on that. We don't want to dismiss that feedback. But if you can't dress in a different way, you can't talk in a different way, you can't act in a different way, or the way that you have been observed, it goes against your values. I think that's where I feel like I've been able to keep my authenticity.
There's some pearls in this we're going to have to dig out here. So our program is about finding your next. So I guess I'd just like to end this by asking you, Sharonne, what is your next?
Well, I don't know that I have, I mean, if you look back at my career, you can imagine I don't have a single next. I got multiple next. I think a lot of my focus right now is I love my role with of faculty development. I feel like my experience is it's a good place for me. And so continuing to expand that and really not only my current mentees, but really launch them. And kind of bigger picture is making particularly cardiology, and I've been involved with the college, is trying to make cardiology a better place to be a cardiologist and to work, not just a cardiologist, for our nurses and for our allied health and for our patients. I think we have some opportunity there. And that's an area that I feel like I have something to offer. I think the other thing with age and experience and with having reached a few measures of success within a career, it gives you a lot more, or it should. And for those of you out there, it should give you more courage to speak out. I sometimes think about now compared to 20, 30 years ago, where I might have been, what will happen to me? Or might I make the situation worse if I speak out? And now I feel like not only I'm relatively bulletproof. What's the worst they can do? Fire me? Yeah, they could. But I've had a long career so I now feel like I have an obligation because if I can speak out where others can't, because there are still people who it's not safe to advocate for certain things. And so I think that's kind of been my next for a few years and will continue to be because I have the privilege and sometimes a platform to speak out about things that I know for a fact some of my colleagues and friends can't or won't for real or imagined fears. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I am. And honestly, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent, I am a daughter, I'm a spouse, and kind of making sure that all of those relationships stay solid and great is important to me next as well.
Sharon, this is so inspiring. I thank you for me and for all of the women in cohort 1 and cohort 2 and hopefully cohort 3, 4, and 5. We're really honored to have you as our inaugural guest, and I really look forward to sharing with you our next. So thank you from the ACC's SJL Mid-Career Institute and our journey to finding our next.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I have enjoyed this a lot and I've enjoyed working with you and have such admiration, particularly for the work you're doing with SJL leadership. So thank you.